It's 2:14 a.m., and while the rest of the world is dreaming about taxes or their high school ex, I'm staring at a stainless steel table and a guy named Gary. Well, his driver's license says Gary. Right now, Gary's more of a biological puzzle than a human being. Welcome to the graveyard shift, literally. If you think being a mortician is all about wearing black suits and looking somber at grave sites while holding a clipboard, you've been watching too many bad movies. Most of my life happens right here, in the prep room, under flickering fluorescent lights that make everyone look like they've been dead for 3 days, including me. The air smells like a very specific, very aggressive cocktail of heavy-duty lavender air freshener and formaldehyde. The kind of scent that doesn't just sit in your nose, it lives in your clothes, your hair, and probably your soul. The phone call usually comes when you're halfway through a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee that tastes like burnt rubber and disappointment. It's the answering service. 1 for pickup, code 4. That's the signal. You put on your scrubs, you grab the keys to the removal van, and you head out into the night. My job isn't just about the dead. It's about the inventory management of mortality. People don't stop dying just because it's a holiday or because it's raining. In fact, the rain usually makes my job busier. Slippery roads, bad decisions, and the inevitable meeting between a sedan and a concrete pillar. When Gary arrived tonight, he wasn't looking his best. That's where the overnight part of the job kicks in. Families want a viewing by 10 a.m. That gives me 8 hours to turn a traumatic exit into a peaceful, sleeping state. It's called restorative art, but honestly, it's more like being a high-stakes mechanic where the parts don't come in a box. First step, the arrival assessment. I have to check for everything. Rigor mortis? Check. Lividity, that's when the blood settles in the lowest parts of the body because the pumps stop working. Check. Any signs of decomposition? If Gary was found 3 days late in a heated apartment, we're playing the game on hard mode. The silence in the prep room is heavy, but it's never empty. You learn to talk to them, not because you expect an answer. If Gary answers, I'm sprinting out that door and never looking back, but because it keeps the brain focused. All right, Gary, let's see what we can do about that bruising. Sarcasm is my primary defense mechanism. You have to have it. If you let the weight of every tragedy sit on your chest, you'll be the one on the table by next Tuesday. You see the best of humanity in their grief and the absolute messiest parts of biology in the basement. It's a weird balance. I'm currently running on 4 hours of sleep, 3 cans of sugar-free energy drink, and a sense of duty that most people would call morbid. But hey, someone has to make sure Gary looks like he's just taking a nap before his final curtain call. The tools are laid out. The arterial tubes, the aneurysm needles, the trocar, the big one that looks like something from a medieval torture chamber, but is actually just for cavity work. Don't ask what cavity work is yet. We'll get to the messy parts soon enough. For now, it's just me, the chemicals, and the quietest roommate I've ever had. You don't just wake up one day and decide you want to drain blood for a living. Well, if you do, the FBI probably has a folder on you. To become a licensed mortuary in the States, you have to go through mortuary science school, which is basically medical school's goth younger brother. Imagine spending 4 years studying anatomy, pathology, and chemistry, but instead of learning how to keep people alive, you're learning exactly what happens when they aren't. The fail rate is surprisingly high, not because the science is impossible, but because the first body usually filters out the tourists. I remember my first time in the lab. They don't give you a peaceful old lady who passed away in her sleep. They give you the reality. They teach you about the big 4: embalming, restorative art, ethics, and business. Because let's be real, a funeral home is a business, even if it's a depressing one. You spend months learning the arterial circle of Willis and how to locate the femoral artery without looking like you're digging for buried treasure. You learn that formaldehyde isn't just a chemical, it's a preservative that turns soft tissue into something resembling leather if you overdo it. The chemistry is brutal. If you mix the wrong index of fluid for a body with jaundice, you'll turn the person bright green. And trust me, nothing says unprofessional than a Hulk-colored grandfather at an open casket service. Then there is the psychology. They don't just teach you how to stitch a scalp, they teach you how to talk to a mother who just lost her teenager. They call it grief counseling, but it's more like being a lightning rod for everyone's worst day. You have to be the pillar of stone while everyone around you is crumbling into dust. In school, they simulate these conversations. It's awkward as hell until you realize that in the real world, there is no script. You just have to be there, smelling like chemicals, offering a tissue and a dignified exit. The exams are grueling. The National Board exam covers everything from the legalities of cremation to the specific way to reconstruct a jawbone shattered by an impact. You have to know the law because if you mess up the paperwork, the state will shut you down faster than a cheap casket in a flood. Apprenticeship is the real trial by fire. You spend a year or two as an intern, which is just a fancy word for the person who mops the prep room floor and does the removals at 4 a.m. on Christmas Eve. You see everything. The suicides, the overdoses, the natural causes that look anything but natural. It hardens you, but it also gives you a very dark, very specific sense of humor. We joke about the dead, not because we don't respect them, but because it's the only way to process the fact that we're all just a few heartbeats away from being the one on the stainless steel. You learn to appreciate life through the lens of its end. You start driving more carefully. You stop skipping doctor appointments. And you definitely stop complaining about having a bad day when your bad day doesn't involve being in a body bag. By the time you get that license, you're not the same person who started. You've seen the exit gate of humanity, and you know exactly how the machinery works. Back to Gary. Tonight isn't a standard easy case. Gary didn't go peacefully. He was involved in a high kinetic event. That's insurance speak for a horrific car wreck. When the body has massive trauma, standard embalming goes out the window. Now we're in the realm of maxillofacial reconstruction. This is the mission. This is the moment where I earn my paycheck and my insomnia. The family wants an open casket. The hospital told them it was impossible. They said closed casket only. But the mother, she needs to see him. She needs that final image to be something other than the police report. The pressure's on. I start with the vascular phase. I need to find a viable artery that isn't severed. It's like trying to fix a plumbing leak in a house that's been hit by a tornado. I use a multi-point injection. Carotid, femoral, axillary. I'm literally repressurizing Gary's circulatory system with a mixture of formaldehyde, humectants, and a pink dye to give him a lifelike glow. You see the color returning to the skin, replacing the gray, ashen mask of death. It's a morbidly beautiful transformation. But the face is the challenge. I spend 3 hours on the bone structure alone, using dental ties, wires, and specialized wax to rebuild the bridge of a nose that isn't there anymore. This is the Caitlin Doughty side of things. Death is fascinating, technical, and deeply human. I'm using a restorative art kit that looks like a high-end makeup bag, but contains heavy-duty adhesives and tissue builders. I'm injecting feature builder under the skin of the cheeks to fill out the hollows caused by dehydration. Every stitch is hidden. Every bruise is neutralized with opaque cosmetics designed for the dead. It's not about making him look like a movie star. It's about making him look like Gary again. Then comes the cavity work, the part no one likes to talk about, the trocar. It's a long, hollow needle connected to a suction line. I have to aspirate the internal organs to prevent gas buildup and purge. It's a violent, rhythmic process that sounds like a wet vacuum. If I don't do this perfectly, the body will react during the service. And reacting is just a polite way of saying it will leak or bloat in front of 200 grieving relatives. Once the aspiration is done, I inject cavity fluid, a concentrate so strong it could probably preserve a steak for 1,000 years. It's 5:30 a.m. now. The sun is starting to peek over the horizon, and I'm putting the final touches on Gary's hair. I've dressed him in his favorite suit, the one his wife brought in yesterday, still smelling like they're home. I step back. The psycho look in my eyes from the caffeine and the stress starts to fade into a weary satisfaction. He looks peaceful. He looks like he's just resting before a long trip. 4 hours later, the family arrives for the private viewing. I'm standing in the shadows, smelling like coffee and bleach, watching from the hallway. The mother walks up to the casket. She stops, she gasps, and then she touches his hand. She isn't screaming, she isn't recoiling, she's weeping, but it's the kind of weeping that comes with a thank you. She stays there for 30 minutes. That's the mission. That's the code black of the mortuary world. I've survived another graveyard shift, navigated the trauma, and delivered a moment of peace in the middle of a nightmare. Now I'm going home to sleep for 12 hours, or at least until the phone rings again. Because in this town, the graveyard shift never really ends. It just waits for the next code 4. Stay safe out there, because if you don't, I'm the one who has to pick up the pieces. Literally.